4:17 in the morning, Stewart Detention Center, Lumpkin, Georgia. A corrections officer keys his radio and asks for a medical response to Housing Unit Delta 2. The response is logged at 4:29, 12 minutes. By the time the nurse arrives, the man in the bunk is no longer breathing. His name won't be released for 9 days. His file lands on the desk of the DHS Inspector General by the end of the week, and it won't be the only one. By spring 2026, the death rate inside Immigration and Customs Enforcement detention has reached a level not seen since the agency began publishing custody mortality data in 2003. 31 in-custody deaths in 8 months. The previous full-year record was 12. Every facility on the agency's contracted list is running above 90% of design capacity. Many sit at 130, 140, even 160%. The numbers aren't a secret. They're posted to the agency's own transparency portal, updated every Friday by an analyst in Washington whose job didn't exist 2 years ago. What's new is who is reading them. The Department of Homeland Security Office of Inspector General, called simply the OIG inside the building, opens a formal investigation on May 14, 2026. The subject line on the internal memorandum reads, "Custodial deaths and use of force, immigration detention facilities, fiscal year 2025, fiscal year 2026. The memo is signed by Joseph V. Kufari, the Inspector General appointed in 2019, a former special agent with the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. 4 pages. It authorizes 16 field auditors, 11 criminal investigators, and a forensic medical contractor. It cites authority under the Inspector General Act of 1978, Section 6. And it does something the OIG rarely does at the opening of a probe. It lists the facilities by name. Stewart, Adelanto, Eloy, Chrome, Otay Mesa, Torrance County, Wynn Correctional, La Palma, Carnes. Each one has appeared on a death notice within the past 9 months. The scale of what the OIG is walking into is hard to overstate. As of June 2026, ICE holds an average daily population of just over 71,000 detainees across roughly 180 facilities. That's a 62% increase from the start of the 2025 enforcement surge. The agency's detention budget for the fiscal year stands at $9.6 billion, a number pushed through Congress in a March supplemental that added $4.1 billion specifically for bed space expansion and contractor reimbursement. The money moved fast. The infrastructure did not. Contracts were signed with 3 new private operators within 40 days of the supplemental's passage. 2 facilities in West Texas were stood up in former oil field man camps. A third, in southern Mississippi, was a shuttered medium-security state prison reopened under a 6-month emergency authorization. None had completed the standard pre-operational medical credentialing review. All 3 accepted their first detainees by April. That is the system the Inspector General is now being asked to audit. From the inside. The first field team arrives at Stewart on May 19th. Led by Assistant Inspector General Diana Shaw, a career federal auditor who joined OIG in 2017 after 11 years at the Government Accountability Office. Shaw is 46, soft-spoken, known for arriving at facility inspections with a clipboard and a thermos of cold coffee. Her team requests medical staffing logs for the previous 180 days. They're handed a binder. The binder has gaps. Specifically, no records at all for the overnight shift on 23 separate dates, including the morning of the death in Delta 2. A facility administrator tells Shaw the records were lost in a server migration. Shaw writes the phrase down verbatim. She underlines it twice. What the early findings show, even in the first weeks, isn't a story of individual cruelty. It's a story of structural collapse. Medical units designed for 600-bed populations are servicing 1,100. A facility in Eloy, Arizona, is running with one licensed physician for a detainee count of 1,540. The contract requires one for every 750. The contractor has been billing for full compliance for 14 consecutive months. The OIG flags the discrepancy as a potential False Claims Act referral within 10 days of arrival. Think about what that means. A federal contractor charging the United States government for medical staff it doesn't employ, while people in its custody are dying for lack of that exact staff. The investigators move from facility to facility through the second half of May and into June. Their findings cluster around three recurring problems. The first is response time. At 9 of the 11 facilities reviewed, the average time between a medical distress call and the arrival of a clinician exceeds 14 minutes. The agency's own performance-based national detention standards require a response within 4. The second is medication. Detainees with documented chronic conditions, diabetes, hypertension, seizure disorders, are being moved between facilities without their prescriptions. Transfers happen at night. Pharmacy records don't follow. The third is use of force. That third one is where the temperature inside the building shifts. On June 2nd, the OIG receives a batch of body-worn camera footage from a facility in Conroe, Texas. The footage covers a use-of-force incident from March 11th involving a 34-year-old Honduran national named Edwin Alvarado Reyes. Alvarado Reyes had been refusing food for 9 days. The footage shows him restrained in a 4-point chair for 97 minutes. He dies 11 hours later in a contracted ambulance en route to a hospital in Houston. The official cause of death on the initial facility report: cardiac event. The autopsy, conducted by the Harris County Medical Examiner, lists positional asphyxia as a contributing factor. The two documents had never been reconciled. Until now. The OIG opens a parallel criminal referral within 48 hours. What makes the Alvarado Reyes case particularly damaging is what the OIG finds when it pulls the personnel files of the 4 officers visible in the footage. 2 had prior use-of-force incidents flagged in their training records. 1 had been disciplined twice in the previous 18 months for failing to complete required de-escalation refreshers. None of that history had been passed to the contracting officer's representative at ICE. The contractor's own internal review, completed on March 18th, concluded that all protocols had been followed. That review is now itself under examination. The investigator assigned to it, a former Army CID warrant officer named Marcus Holley, tells colleagues in an internal email, later obtained by congressional staff, that he has rarely seen documentation this thoroughly contradicted by its own video record. The obvious question is why this oversight is happening now, during the largest enforcement push in the agency's history, rather than during any previous expansion. The answer is mechanical. The Inspector General Act lets the OIG initiate audits at its own discretion, but its resources are finite. Until the March supplemental, the OIG's Detention Oversight Unit had 7 full-time personnel. The same supplemental that funded the bed space expansion also, almost as an afterthought, buried on page 218, tripled the OIG's detention oversight budget. The Watchdog grew at the same moment its workload did. That's not a coincidence. It's the result of a single amendment introduced by a Senate Appropriations staffer named Rachel Kim, who had spent 4 years as a GAO analyst before moving to the Hill. 1 staffer, 1 amendment, 1 paragraph. The entire architecture of the current investigation sits on it. By mid-June, the OIG isn't the only outside body looking at ICE detention. On June 16th, the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights releases a 47-page report titled Conditions of Immigration Detention in the United States, a Preliminary Assessment. The report draws on interviews with 211 current and former detainees conducted by phone and through legal intermediaries between January and May. It cites violations of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, to which the United States is a party. It doesn't name individual facilities. It doesn't have to. The patterns it describes line up, almost paragraph by paragraph, with what the OIG's field teams are documenting on the ground. 3 days later, Human Rights Watch publishes its own report. 62 pages, 28 detainee deaths examined in detail, photographs, medical records obtained through families. The HRW report is led by researcher Clara Long, who has been documenting U.S. immigration detention since 2014. Long's report includes a sentence that gets quoted in nearly every subsequent news story. The medical infrastructure inside ICE custody has not failed. It was never built to handle the population it has been asked to absorb. 3 reports, 1 week, 1 agency. Inside ICE headquarters at 512th Street Southwest in Washington, the response is measured and slow. The agency's acting deputy director issues a statement on June 19th, acknowledging the OIG investigation and pledging full cooperation. 83 words. It doesn't mention the UN report. It doesn't mention Human Rights Watch. Internally, though, the agency convenes a working group, 11 senior officials, daily meetings. The group is asked to produce a 30-day remediation plan covering medical staffing, transfer protocols, and use of force review procedures. The deadline is July 19th. The remediation plan will be late. The pressure doesn't stay confined to oversight bodies. On June 22nd, a federal magistrate judge in the Western District of Louisiana issues a temporary restraining order halting all transfers into the Wynn Correctional Center pending a medical capacity review. The order follows a habeas petition filed by attorneys from the Southern Poverty Law Center on behalf of 14 detainees. The lead attorney, Sarah Rich, is 38 years old, a graduate of NYU Law, and has been litigating detention conditions cases for 9 years. Her petition runs 112 pages. It includes affidavits from 2 former Wynn medical staff who resigned in March, citing unsafe patient-to-provider ratios. The judge's order is 14 pages. It cites the OIG memorandum directly. That is the first time anywhere in the federal court system that an active Inspector General investigation has been used as evidentiary support in a detention conditions ruling. It won't be the last. Within a week, similar petitions are filed in the Southern District of Texas, the District of New Mexico, and the Middle District of Georgia. The Georgia petition, filed on June 27th, names Stewart Detention Center directly and asks the court to compel disclosure of the missing overnight staffing logs, the same logs Diana Shaw was told had been lost in a server migration. The petition is signed by a coalition of 3 nonprofit legal organizations and includes a sworn declaration from a former Stewart corrections officer who left the facility in February. The officer, identified in the filing only as J.D. to protect against retaliation, states that overnight medical coverage at Stewart had been reduced to a single licensed practical nurse covering 2,040 beds for at least the preceding 6 months. The declaration doesn't appear in any agency report. It appears in the court record. You might wonder why the agency doesn't simply reduce the population, release detainees on supervised alternatives, cut the overcrowding at its source. The answer is in the appropriations language. The March supplemental didn't just fund bed space. It tied a portion of the funding to maintained occupancy levels. The bill requires ICE to maintain an average daily population of at least 65,000 detainees through the end of the fiscal year. Drop below that floor, and a portion of the funding reverts. The mandate is structural. It's also mathematical. To comply with the floor, the agency must continue intake at roughly the current pace, even as facilities exceed capacity. The system is designed to keep filling itself. It was a bad call, but it was the only call the appropriators thought they had left. The real problem here isn't who you might expect. Not a single warden, not a single contractor, not a single political appointee. It's the procurement process itself. 40 years of emergency authorizations, fixed-price contracts, and occupancy floors that have built a detention system where no individual actor has the authority to slow down. The wardens are obligated to accept transfers. The contractors are obligated to maintain beds.
The agency is obligated to maintain the floor. And the people inside, the detainees, the nurses, the corrections officers working double shifts, are absorbing the consequences of decisions made years ago by people who will never see the inside of a facility. The OIG's preliminary findings are scheduled for release in 2 phases. The first, covering medical staffing and emergency response, is due in mid-August. The second, covering use of force and custodial deaths, is expected in October. Shaw has told her team to prepare for the possibility that both reports will be partially classified. Some source material, body camera footage, autopsy photographs, internal incident reports, won't be released publicly. What will be released, according to a draft outline reviewed by congressional staff, includes a facility-by-facility scorecard, response times, staffing ratios, death counts. The scorecard alone will run more than 90 pages. That is the document the agency is most concerned about. The deaths continue. On June 24th, a 52-year-old Venezuelan national dies at the Torrance County Detention Facility in Estancia, New Mexico. He had been in custody for 41 days. He had requested medical attention 7 times in the previous week. The requests were logged, but not escalated. His name has not yet been released. His file has already been forwarded to the OIG. It is the 32nd death of the fiscal year. 2 days later, on June 26th, a 29-year-old Guatemalan woman is hospitalized in critical condition after a seizure at the Karnes County facility in South Texas. She had a documented history of epilepsy. Her medication had not been administered in 11 days. The pharmacy records, according to a preliminary OIG note, show that her prescription had been transferred from a facility in Arizona on June 14th, but had never been entered into the Karnes dispensing system. She will survive. The note documenting her case runs to 3 sentences. It is appended to a growing file the OIG has begun internally labeling Pharmacy Transfer Failures, Pattern Evidence. 4:17 in the morning. That was the time on the radio call from Stewart back at the start. The OIG has now reviewed the audio. They've also reviewed the camera footage from the corridor outside Delta 2. The footage shows a corrections officer arriving at the door at 4:18. He looks in through the window. He keys his radio. Then he walks away. He returns at 4:26. The nurse arrives at 4:29. The 8 minutes between 4:18 and 4:26 are not explained in any incident report, not in any interview transcript. They're the kind of gap that an Inspector General's office is designed to find. Whether anyone is ever held accountable for those 8 minutes is a question that won't be answered in 2026. The investigation will run into next year. The reports will land in stages. The litigation will continue. The appropriation cycle will reset in October, and a new floor, or no floor at all,
will be debated on the Senate floor by people who have read the OIG's findings and people who have not. But the file from Delta 2 is open. The name on it will eventually be public. And somewhere in a federal building in Washington, an auditor named Diana Shaw is still writing in the margins of a binder, underlining the same phrase twice, then 3 times, then 4. Lost in a server migration. That's the sentence the entire investigation begins with. It's also the sentence that explains why an investigation became necessary in the first place.